Good morning, YouTube. Today we're going to continue with Schopenhauer from section 5 of book 1 of The World as Will and Representation. We must, however, guard against the gross misunderstanding of supposing, I'll just get it a bit, of supposing that because intuition is mediated by cognition of causality, there must therefore be a cause-effect relation between subject and object, whereas in fact such a relation only ever exists between the immediate and the mediate object, that is, between objects. This is the false supposition at the heart of that foolish dispute over the reality of the external world, in which dogmatism, appearing first as realism and then as idealism, and skepticism confront each other. Realism posits the object as cause and locates the effect in the subject. Fichtean idealism makes the object into an effect of the subject. But what cannot be emphasized enough is that in terms of the principle of sufficient reason, there is no relation at all between subject and object. As a result, neither of the two claims was susceptible of any proof, and skepticism launched successful attacks on both. The law of causality is already prior to intuition and experience. It is their condition, and thus cannot be gleaned from experience, as Hume thought. Similarly, subject and object are already prior to all cognition and serve as its primary condition. This is why they are also prior to the principle of sufficient reason in general, since this is simply the form of all objects, the universal manner in which objects appear. But the object always presupposes the subject, so there can be no ground or consequent relation between them. My essay on the principle of sufficient reason is intended to render the following service. It presents the content of this principle, the essential form of all objects, that is, the universal manner in which all objects exist, as something that belongs to the object as such. But the object as such always presupposes the subject as its necessary correlate. So the subject always remains outside the jurisdiction of the principle of sufficient reason. The dispute over the reality of the external world is, in fact, based on this improper extension of the validity of the principle of sufficient reason to the subject. Given this mistake, the dispute could make no sense, even on its own terms. On the one side, dogmatic realism claims to separate the representation from the object, even though they are one and the same, by treating the representation as the effect of the object. This involves assuming the existence of a cause that is completely distinct from the representation, an object in itself that is independent of the subject. But this is totally inconceivable because as an object, it would always presuppose a subject and hence is only ever the representation of a subject. Using the same false assumption, skepticism opposes this position by arguing that in representation we only ever have the effect and never the cause, that we only know how the object acts, never what it is. That is, action might not bear the least resemblance to what it is, and indeed that it may be completely wrong to assume that the object exists at all, since skepticism argues that the law of causality is derived from experience, but now claims that the reality of this experience is itself supposed to depend on the law of causality. On this point, both doctrines would be well advised to note first that representation and object are the same thing, and second, that for objects of intuition, their being simply is their acting. Acting is precisely what constitutes the actuality of a thing. To insist that objects exist outside the representation of a subject, and to insist that actual objects have a being distinct from their acting, these demands are completely meaningless and contradictory. It follows that all we know about an object of intuition, insofar as it is an object, that is, a representation, is the way it acts. There is nothing left to know about an object apart from its representation. To this extent, the world intuited in space and time, which manifests itself as pure causality, is completely real. The world is exactly as it presents itself, and it presents itself completely and without reserve as representation, held together by the law of causality. This is its empirical reality. But on the other hand, causality exists only in the understanding and for the understanding. Thus, the understanding is always the condition for the actual, that is, active world as such and in its entirety. Without the understanding, this world is nothing. But this is not the only reason why we must emphatically deny the dogmatist's declaration that the external world is real apart from the subject. The dogmatist is always wrong because it is impossible to consistently think any object at all apart from a subject. The entire world of objects is and remains representation, and precisely because of this, it is and will always be thoroughly conditioned by the subject, that is, the world has transcendental ideality. But this is also why the world is not a lie or an illusion. It presents itself as what it is, as representation, and in fact as a series of representations bound together by the principle of sufficient reason. To those with common sense, this is how the world is. Even its innermost meaning is comprehensible and speaks a language of utter clarity. Only a mind distorted by sophistry would think to argue about its reality. And when that does happen, it is always the result of an invalid application of the principle of sufficient reason. This principle does indeed combine representations of whatever sort they may be, but it certainly does not combine representations with the subject or with something that would be neither subject nor object, but rather merely the ground of the object. This concept is incomprehensible because only objects can act as grounds, and in fact, they can only ground other objects. Aside from this invalid extension of the principle of sufficient reason to something outside its province, further investigation into the source of the question of the reality of the external world reveals that there is also a quite specific confusion between the forms of the principle, namely the form referring solely to concepts or abstract representations, is transferred to intuitive representations, real objects, and a ground of cognition is then required for objects, even though they can only have a ground of becoming. The principle of sufficient reason governs abstract representations, concepts linked to form judgments in such a way that each judgment derives its value, its validity, and its entire existence, here called truth, solely and completely by means of the relation of judgment to something external, its cognitive ground, and thus we must always return to it. On the other hand, the principle of sufficient reason does not govern real objects, intuitive representations, as the principle of the ground of cognition, but rather of becoming, that is, or as the law of causality. All objects have already paid their debt to the principle of sufficient reason by coming to be at all, that is, by occurring as the cause of, as the effect of a cause. It is not valid, nor is it even meaningful to demand a cognitive ground in this case. To demand is only appropriate for a completely different class of objects. It follows that the intuitive world arouses neither scruple nor doubt in the beholder who remains with it. Here we find neither truth nor error. These are confined to the domain of abstract and reflective. Here the world lies open for the senses and for understanding. It presents itself with naive truthfulness as just what it is, intuitive representation, developing in a law-like manner, according to the strictures of causality. As we have treated the question of the reality of the external world up to this point, it always stemmed from an error of reasoning, one that went so far as a misunderstanding of reason itself. Accordingly, we could answer the question simply by clarifying its content. The question had to resolve itself because there was no meaning left in it after we investigated the whole essence of the principle of sufficient reason, the subject-object relation, and the actual character of sensory intuition. But the question has yet another source, quite distinct from the purely speculative one we have given up to now. This source is in fact empirical, although the question is also only ever raised from a speculative point of view, and in this sense, its meaning is much easier to understand than it was with the first source. It is this: we have dreams. Is the whole of life not in some way a dream? Or more specifically, is there a definitive criterion to distinguish between dream and reality, between phantasms and real objects? The claim that a dream is not as vivid and clear as a real intuition does not deserve any consideration at all. No one has ever held the two next to each other for comparison. The reality of the present moment can only be compared to the memory of a dream. Kant resolves the question this way. What distinguishes life from a dream is the way representations are connected to each other by the law of causality. But even in a dream, all the individual details are connected together by the principle of sufficient reason in all its different forms. This coherence is broken only between life and dreams or between individual dreams. So Kant's answer can really only be this: the long dream life is completely connected by the principle of sufficient reason, but only within itself, not with the short dreams, even though each of these is similarly consistent within itself. The bridge that leads from one to the other is therefore broken, and that is how we can tell them apart. Nevertheless, it would be very difficult and often impossible to use this criterion to investigate whether something was a dream or a real event. We are in no position to follow the causal connections, link by link, from the present moment back to every event we have experienced, but we do not, for that reason, declare them to be dreams. As a result, this method of investigation is not generally used in real life to distinguish dream from reality. The only certain criterion for distinguishing between dream and actuality is, in fact, none other than the quite empirical one of waking up. When we wake up, the causal connection between dream events and events in waking life is expressly and perceptibly broken. Hobbes makes a remark in chapter 2 of the Leviathan that is an excellent example of this. Namely, after accidentally falling asleep in our clothes, we readily mistake dreams for reality and are even more likely to do so when, in addition, our thoughts are all absorbed by some task or project which occupies us in the dream just as much as it does in waking life. In these cases, we are no more aware of waking up than we were of falling asleep. Dream runs together with reality and becomes mixed up with it. Then, admittedly, only Kant's criterion is left to use. But if a causal connection or lack of connection to the present cannot be discovered afterwards, as is often the case, then it must always remain undecided whether an occurrence was dreamed or really happened. Now we are confronted at close quarters with the intimate relationship between living and dreaming, and we should not be ashamed to admit as much after it has been recognized and articulated by so many great minds. The closest comparison known to the Vedas and the Puranas for our whole knowledge of the actual world, which they call the web of Maya, is that of dream. The closest comparison. And this is the comparison they use most frequently. Plato often says that people live merely in a dream and only the philosopher strives to wake up. Pindar writes, man is the dream of a shadow, and Sophocles, I see that we, the living, are nothing more than phantoms and ephemeral chimera. Ajax 125. Shakespeare stands most worthily in this company. We are such stuff as dreams are made of, and our little life is rounded with a sleep. Tempest, Act 4, Scene 1. Lastly, Calderon was so deeply gripped by this view that he sought to express it in a kind of metaphysical dream called Life is a Dream, metaphysical drama. Now, after so many poetic quotations, I must be pardoned for expressing myself figuratively as well. Life and dreams are the pages of one and the same book. In real life, we read the pages in coherent order, but when the hour appointed for reading, that is, the day, is done and the time for rest has come, then we often leaf idly through the book, turning now to this page and now to another, in no particular order or sequence. Sometimes we turn to a page that we have already read, and sometimes to an unknown one, but they are always from the same book. So a page read separately is indeed out of sequence in comparison to the pages that have been read in order, but it is not so much the worse for that. especially when we bear in mind that a whole constructive reading starts and finishes just as arbitrarily. In fact, it should really be seen as itself only a single, separate, although larger, page. Thus, individual dreams are distinct from real life in that they do not mesh with the sequence of experiences that always runs through real life. Waking marks this difference. But real life has this interconnection of experiences because interconnection is the form of experience. And in the same way, dreams also manifest in a connection within themselves. But if we now adopt the point of view of a judge standing outside of both, then there is no definitive way to distinguish between them. And we must concede to the poets that life is an extended dream. Let us leave this separate empirical source for the question of the reality of the external world and return to its speculative source. We have found that this lies first in the invalid application of the principle of sufficient reason to the relation between subject and object. It also lies in a confusion of two forms of the principle of sufficient reason, in which the principle of sufficient reason of cognition is transferred into an area in which the principle of sufficient reason of becoming applies. But this question could not have preoccupied philosophers so stubbornly if it were so devoid of any real content, if there was no truth, no meaning at all in its innermost core, nothing lying at the bottom of it. Accordingly, we can assume that as this original sense became a subject for reflection and tried to express itself, it would have taken on these inverted forms and been posed in questions that do not make sense, even on their own terms. This, anyway, is what I think happened, and for a pure expression of this innermost sense of the question, which the question itself did not know how to hit upon, I suggest the following. What is this world of intuition apart from being my representation? I am conscious of this world only once as representation, but is it in fact like my body, of which I am conscious twice over, once as representation and once as will? The second book will consist of a clear explanation as to why the answer of this question is yes. And the rest of this work will be concerned with the consequences of this discovery. Section 6. Meanwhile, in this first book, we will treat everything merely as representation, as an object for the subject, even the body itself. Everyone's point of departure for intuition of the world is no different from any other real object, and we will treat it too only to the extent that it can be known in cognition. That is, it is for us merely a representation. Anyone who is already hostile to the idea that other objects are mere representations will be even more resistant to the idea that the body itself is also merely a representation. The reason is this: we have immediate cognition of the thing in itself when it appears to us as our own body, but our cognition is only indirect when the thing in itself is objectified in other objects of intuition. But the order of our exposition requires this abstract and one-sided perspective, forcibly separating things that belong together necessarily. So any hostility towards it must be temporarily stifled and appeased through the expectation that the one-sidedness of the present considerations will be balanced out by what follows to complete our cognition of the essence of the world. So at this stage, we will be treating the body as immediate object, which is to say, as the representation that serves as starting point for the subject's cognition. The body is the starting point because we are directly acquainted with the alterations it undergoes, and these alterations precede any application of the law of causality and thus supply it with its initial data. As we have already shown, the essence of matter is action, but cause and effect exist only for the understanding, which is nothing more than their subjective correlate. And the understanding could never be successfully applied without some other thing as a starting point. This other thing is pure sensation and immediate consciousness of alterations in the body that makes the body an immediate object. Accordingly, there are two conditions for the possibility of cognition of the intuitive world. Expressed objectively, the first condition is the ability of bodies to act on each other and bring about alterations in each other. Without this universal property possessed by all bodies, no intuition would be possible, including the sensibility of animal bodies. On the other hand, if we want to find a subjective expression for this very same condition, we must say this: the understanding makes intuition possible primarily because the law of causality, and so the possibility of cause and effect has its source in and is valid only for the understanding. Hence, the intuitive world exists only for and through the understanding. The second condition is the sensibility of animal bodies, the property that certain bodies possess of being the immediate object for the subject. When something external acts in an appropriate way on the sense organs, the alterations they undergo deserve to be called representations only if they do not arouse pain or pleasure. For if they have no immediate meaning for the will, then they can be perceived and exist only for cognition, so that this extent I claim So to this extent, I claim that we have immediate cognition of the body and that it is an immediate object. In this context, however, the concept object should be taken into anything, should not be taken into anything like its proper sense. It should not be taken in anything like its proper sense, because immediate cognition is really pure sensation. As such, it is prior to the application of the understanding, and so the body is not really there as an object at all. Rather, the bodies acting upon it are what are there as objects first and foremost. Cognition of proper objects, that is, representations intuited in space, occurs only through and for the understanding and comes only after and not before application of the understanding. Consequently, cognition of the body as a proper object, that is, an intuitive representation in space, is mediated, like that of all other objects, by a prior application of the law of causality to the action of one part of the body on another. For instance, when the eye sees the body or the hand touches it. As a result, we cannot discover the shape of our own body just by using the sense of touch. Even our own body presents itself as something extended, articulated, and organic, only through cognition, only as a representation, which means only in the brain. Someone born blind attains this representation only gradually by means of information supplied by touch. A blind man without hands would never get to know the shape of his body, or might at best gradually construct and infer this knowledge from the action of other objects on the body. When we call the body an immediate object, it should be understood with this caveat. In addition, it also follows from what has been said above that all animal bodies are immediate objects, that is, starting points for intuition of the world by that seat of all cognition, the subject, which for this very reason can never itself be known. So cognition, together with the movement upon motives which it makes possible, is the fundamental characteristic of animal life. In just the same way, the characteristic of plants is movement according to stimuli. Inorganic beings, however, move only as a result of causes understood in the narrowest sense. I've explained all this in great detail in my essay on the principle of sufficient reason, second edition, section 20, as well as in my ethics, first edition, III, and on vision and colours, section 1. I therefore refer the reader to these texts. From what has been said, it is clear that all animals, even the most imperfect, possess understanding. They all have cognition of objects, and this cognition serves as a motive that determines their movements. Understanding is the same in all animals as well as in all human beings. It has the same unitary form in every case: cognition of causality, transition from effect to cause, and from cause to effect, and nothing else besides. But the acuity of the understanding and the scope of its knowledge vary enormously and are divided very finely into many different degrees. The lowest degree recognizes only the causal relation between the immediate and mediate objects, and therefore succeeds only in progressing from the effect the body undergoes to its cause, thereby intuiting this cause as an object in space. The higher degrees involve knowledge of the causal nexus, merely of mediate objects in relation to each other. The higher degrees involve knowledge of the causal nexus merely of mediate objects in relation to each other, leading to an understanding of complex chains of causes and effects in nature. Even this latter is still a capacity of the understanding rather than reason. The abstract concepts of reason can serve only to take up what is immediately understood, to fix and combine it. They can never produce understanding itself. Every natural force and natural law in every instance in which they are expressed must first of all be immediately recognised and grasped intuitively by the understanding before it can enter abstractly into reflective consciousness for reasoning. Hooke's discovery of the law of gravitation was an immediate and intuitive comprehension that took place by means of the understanding, as was the derivation of so many important phenomena from this law, which Newton's calculations later confirmed. Lavoisier's discovery of oxygen and the important role it plays in nature was the same, and so was Goiter's discovery of the origin of physical colours. All these discoveries simply move directly and accurately from effect to back to the cause. which leads directly to a recognition of the identity of the natural force that expresses itself in all cases, in all causes of the same kind. And this whole insight is an expression of the same and sole function of the understanding that an animal uses to intuit the cause that acts on its body as an object in space, differing from it only in degree. It follows that all these great discoveries are, like intuition or every expression of the understanding, immediate insights, and as such, the work of a moment. They are a percus, striking all at once, and are not the result of long chains of reasoning in the abstract. A percus. Is that little dangly bit there, I think, makes the C sound different to the S. This one, topic. I'll just pop it in the dictionary and see whether anything comes up. No. So I'll just pop it over to Google. And, oh, look. A percus, pronounced a persos. A perso is a French word. A perçu is a French word meaning a brief glimpse, insight, summary, or outline, often referring to a sudden understanding or a concise overview of something complex, like an intuitive grasp of truth or a quick sketch of a story. It can also refer to collections of witty observations and aphorisms such as Mignon McLaughlin's book. There we go. It follows that all these great discoveries are, like intuition of every expression or every expression of the understanding, immediate insights, and as such, the work of a moment. They are a brief glimpse, insight, summary, or outline, striking all at once, and are not the result of long chains of reasoning in the abstract. Abstract reasoning serves rather to fix the immediate cognition of the understanding or reason by setting it down in abstract concepts, that is, by making it clear, that is, putting it into a state to be interpreted for others to make it meaningful. This acuity of the understanding, that's just like acute, right? Let me double check. Clear vision. Wrong one. This one. How come some of the apps close down completely when you press the red and some of them do not? Sharpness or keenness of thought, vision, or hearing. Late Middle English or French, acuite, and medieval Latin, acuitas, from Latin, acuere, sharpen, see, acute. This acuity of the understanding, when it grasps the causal relations of objects that are themselves only indirectly known, is of some application in the natural sciences. In fact, it is reasonable for all scientific discoveries, but it is also applied in practical life, where it is called cleverness, although in scientific applications it is better known as acumen, penetration, or sagacity. Strictly speaking, cleverness refers only to the use of the understanding in the service of the will. But the distinction between the two concepts cannot be sharply drawn because in both cases it is a question of one and the same function of the understanding, that is already active in animals when they intuit objects in space. At its highest degree of acuity, it can accurately investigate the unknown causes of natural phenomena on the basis of their given effects and thereby provide reason with the material it requires to conceive of universal rules as natural laws. Or it may invent complicated and ingenious machines by applying known causes to desired effects, or it may be applied to motivation, either to penetrate or frustrate subtle intrigues or machinations, or, on the other hand, to suitably arrange people and the motives they are susceptible to so that they can be set in motion like the levers and clogs of machines and steered towards some desired goal. Lack of understanding is stupidity in the original sense of the word. I will have a look at that. Copy. Dictionary should have that. And I believe you can see the dictionary now. See my reminders come up as well. Paste. Stupidity. Behaviour that shows a lack of good sense or judgment. The quality of being stupid or unintelligent. Well, what's the in the original? I'll just go to a better dictionary. Copy. Search with Google. Go down. It's this one. Stupidity is a lack of intelligence, understanding, or good judgment, leading to foolish actions and poor decisions. That's the what? Quality of being stupid or unintelligent. Stupidity, Merriam-Webster. Quality or state of being stupid. That's pretty handy. A stupid idea or act. Circa 1541, in the meaning defined in sense 1, which is the quality or state of being stupid. That's the itty doing that, quality or state situation. Slow of mind, obtuse, given to unintelligent decisions or acts, acting in an unintelligent or careless manner, lacking intelligence or reason, brutish, dull in feeling or sensation, torpid, marked by or resulting from unreasoned thinking or acting, senseless, lacking interest or point, vexatious, exasperating, stupidness noun, a stupid person. Stupider is a perfectly good word that has been used in use for hundreds of years. More stupid is also commonly used for the same purpose. Is stupidest a word? The word stupidest has been in use for hundreds of years. There is nothing wrong with it. Most stupid means the same thing, and people who don't like stupidest should feel free to use it instead. How do you use stupider in a sentence? I won't read that. Synonyms? Choose the right synonym. Stupid, dull, dense, crass, dumb mean lacking in power to absorb ideas or impressions. I won't go there. Okay. Back here. Lack of understanding is stupidity in the original sense of the word. Original sense, it doesn't say except 1, 2, 3, 4, A, B, C. So slow of mind, given to unintelligent decisions or acts. Lacking intelligence or reason, dulled in feeling or sensation. Okay, lack of understanding is stupidity in the original sense of the word. It is an obtuseness in applying the law of causality, an inability to gain an immediate grasp of the link between cause and effect, or between motive and action. Stupid people cannot see the interconnection between natural phenomena, either when these phenomena occur on their own or when they are consciously controlled, that is, pressed into service as machines. They therefore easily believe in magic and miracles. Stupid people do not notice that others who appear to be acting independently may in fact have made previous arrangements with each other. This is why they are quickly baffled and make easy targets for intrigues. They do not see that someone may have an ulterior motive when giving advice or proffering an opinion. But in each case, just one thing is always lacking: acuity, quickness, and an effortless use of the law of causality, that is, strength of understanding. The best example of stupidity that I have come across, and the most informative in the present context, is that of a completely imbecilic boy of about 11 years who lived in an asylum. He was rational, since he could both speak and understand, but had a less developed understanding than many animals. Every time I visited, he would stare at a monocle I wore around my neck. It reflected the windows of the room and the tops of the trees so that they appeared to be behind my neck. This he regarded with great surprise and joy every time I was there, and looked at the glass with unwavering astonishment. He could not understand the absolutely immediate causality of reflection. There can be quite different degrees of acuity in human understanding, but there are even greater differences in acuity among the various species of animals. But all animals, even those that are closest to plants, have at least enough understanding to proceed from effects in the immediate object to a mediate object as cause. This is to achieve the intuition or apprehension of an object. This level of understanding is what makes them animals in the first place. It permits movement on the basis of motives, and in so doing, the possibility of searching for, or at least grasping at, nourishment. Plants, on the other hand, move only on the basis of a stimulus, and they must therefore either wait for it to influence them directly, or else languish because they cannot go after or grasp it. We are astonished at the great wisdom shown by the highest animals, dogs, elephants, apes, and foxes, whose cunning was so masterfully described by Buffon. The cleverest animals allow us to measure quite precisely what the understanding can do without the aid of reason, that is, in the absence of abstract conceptual knowledge. We cannot recognize this so easily in ourselves because, in our case, reason and understanding always mutually support one another. As a result, we find that displays of understanding in animals sometimes exceed, but at other times fall short of our expectations. For instance, we are surprised by the wisdom displayed by an elephant that had previously travelled in Europe and had therefore already crossed a number of bridges, but which refused to step onto one particular bridge, even though it could see the rest of the train of people and horses crossing, because to it the bridge did not seem strong enough to bear its weight. On the other hand, we are astonished when the clever orangutan finds a fire to warm itself, but does not keep it going by adding wood. This shows that maintaining a fire requires deliberation and cannot be achieved without abstract concepts. The universal form of the understanding, cognition of cause and effect, is the prior condition for any intuitive cognition of the external world, for animals just as for us. But this fact already demonstrates with complete certainty that this form exists a priori, even in animals. Yet, if another special proof is wanted, consider, for example, the following. Even a very young dog does not dare to jump off a table, however much it wants to, because it foresees the effect of the weight of its body, and it will refrain even though it does not know anything about this specific case from experience. But in our assessment of animal understanding, we must guard against attributing to understanding what is really a manifestation of instinct. Instinct is a characteristic quite distinct from both understanding and reason, although it often operates in a way analogous to the combined efforts of these two. Discussion of this does not belong here, but we will undertake instead when we consider the harmony or so-called teleology of nature in the second book. The 27th chapter of the supplementary volume is also devoted to this topic. Lack of understanding is stupidity. Later, we will see that an inability to use reason in the practical sphere is folly, and that lack of judgment is simple-mindedness. Finally, loss of memory, whether partial or complete, is madness. Each of these will be considered in its rightful place. What we have correct cognition of through reason is truth. That is, an abstract judgment which, with an adequate ground. Essay on the Principle of Sufficient Reason, sections 25, FF. What we have correct cognition of through the understanding is reality. That is, the correct transition from an effect in the immediate object to its cause. Error, in contrast to truth, is a deception of reason, and illusion, in contrast to reality, is a deception of the understanding. The first chapter of my essay on vision and colours contains a more complete discussion of all these issues. An illusion occurs when two very different causes are able to give rise to one and the same effect. And one of the causes occurs very frequently while the other does not. Since there is no datum, the understanding can use to distinguish between the two causes. The effect is exactly the same in both cases. It supposes that the more frequent cause is at work. But because the understanding acts directly and immediately rather than discursively or reflectively, the wrong cause stands before us as an intuited object, and this is the illusion. On vision and colours, I also showed how double vision and double touching result when the sense organs are put into an unusual position, and this proves beyond doubt that intuition can take place only through and for the understanding. Some examples of deception of the understanding, that is, illusions, include a stick submerged in water appearing to be broken, and reflected images in spherical mirrors. When the surface of one of those mirrors is convex, the images appear to be partially behind the mirror, and when the surface is concave, they appear to be far in front of it. Another relevant example is the apparently greater size of the moon on the horizon compared with its size at the zenith. This is not an optical effect because a micrometer can be used to show that the moon actually encompasses a slightly greater angular area of the eye at its zenith than on the horizon. Rather, it is the understanding that assumes that the reduced brightness of the moon and all the stars on the horizon is the effect of their greater remoteness. It treats them like objects on Earth, according to atmospheric perspective, and therefore takes the moon to be much larger on the horizon than at its zenith. For just the same reason, it takes the whole dome of the sky to be very much larger on the horizon and therefore flattened out. When only the summit of a very high mountain is visible through clear and transparent air, this same invalid application of atmospheric perspective makes it appear closer than it really is, which detracts from its height. Mount Blanc looks like this when viewed from Selence. All these deceptive illusions are right before our eyes in unmediated intuition. No amount of reasoning can remove them. Reasoning can only prevent error, that is, a judgment made without adequate ground, and replace it with a true judgment. For example, we can recognize in the abstract that the cause of the reduced brightness of the moon and stars is the duller haze on the horizon rather than their greater distance. But in all these cases, the illusion stubbornly persists despite this abstract recognition. The understanding is clearly and completely distinct from reason, the cognitive faculty specific to human beings, and even in human beings, the understanding, considered in itself, is unreasonable. Reason can only ever know. Intuition remains for the understanding alone and is free from the influence of reason. Section 7 is where I stopped today. Okay. Thank you, YouTube, for your astute attendance and questions that you leave in the comments. And I'll end now. Thank you. Oops.